11 to 12 talks about God's power stilling the chaotic sea and striking down this monstrous kind of sea creature that's named Rahab. The lectionary passage that I'm eventually going to get to today is another passage that addresses God's relationship to the sea. But before that, I do want to take a look at the first chapter of the Bible, Genesis 1, and see what it has to say about God's relationship to the sea, or as it appears there, the pre-creation waters. So let's look at Genesis 1, 1 to 2. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So as Genesis 1 tells it, there was this expanse of water there at the very, very beginning. Interesting that there was water in existence before the days of creation, but that's going to have to be a story for another day. Anyway, so we have this pre-creation sea, this chaotic, unordered force present there at the beginning of the world, and the Spirit of God is described as, quote-unquote, hovering over those waters. The Hebrew verb that's used there in Genesis 1:2 that is translated in the English translation as hover also occurs in Deuteronomy. And so I want to take a quick look there because I think this passage helps better explain what that's referring to when it says that God is hovering over the waters. So let's look at that. Deuteronomy 32, 10 to 11. He found him in a desert land, and in the howling waste of the wilderness, he encircled him. He cared for him. He kept him as the apple of his eye. Like an eagle that stirs up its nest, that flutters over its young, spreading out its wings, catching them, bearing them up on its pinions. So that same verb that's used there for a bird fluttering or hovering over its young in like this protective way is that same one that's used in Genesis for the activity of the Spirit of God above those chaotic pre-creation waters. So, in other words, from the beginning, the Spirit of God has been present there alongside the chaos. In Genesis 1, the Spirit is pictured in a way in the role of a mother bird, like in that Deuteronomy passage, hovering protectively over the chaos that would become our world. I do think this still leaves a lot of questions unanswered, but there is something very powerful about that idea of God hovering protectively in this mothering way in the midst of our own chaos. Not necessarily zapping the chaos away, but somehow being present there in the midst of us. There are a lot of other Old Testament passages that we could talk about with this theme. There's the flood in Genesis 6, the parting of the Red Sea, many other poetic passages about God's kind of mastery over the waters and over chaos. But let's go finally to the lectionary passage. So this is Psalm 104, 24 to 30. And I'll read the whole passage and then we'll discuss it a little bit. O Lord, how manifold are your works. In wisdom have you made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. Here is the sea, great and wide, which teems with creatures innumerable, living things both small and great. There go the ships and Leviathan, which you formed to play in it. These all look to you to give them their food in due season. When you give it to them, they gather it up. When you open your hand, they are filled with good things. When you hide your face, they are dismayed. When you take away their breath, they die and return to their dust. When you send forth your spirit, they are created, and you renew the face of the ground. So in this psalm, the author depicts the chaotic sea, the animals within it, highlighting the sea creature Leviathan, which if you look at some of the other places in the Bible where it's mentioned, it's almost described like a monster. And all of these are portrayed as being completely and utterly at the mercy of God. So having the background now that we talked about with the sea, we can recognize that it's not just some nice poetic imagery when it talks about God's relationship to the sea and the animals in it. So if we look again at verses 28 to 29, when you give it to them, they gather it up. When you open your hand, they are filled with good things. When you hide your face, they are dismayed. When you take away their breath, they die and return to their dust. Again, the creatures within the chaotic sea are described as having no agency or power, really, of their own. The psalmist suggests that the forces of chaos have no chance of overcoming God's order. There's ultimately no contest, no real struggle or a violent battle like we see in that ancient story that I referenced. Rather, the redemptive, creative Spirit of God always trumps the chaos. This theme of God's triumph over the chaotic waters continues actually into the New Testament, and I want to briefly just mention two passages there. So first of all, Jesus walking on the water. We'll read a couple of verses from the version in Matthew. So this is Matthew 14, 25 to 26. And in the fourth watch of the night he came to them walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost," and they cried out in fear. We unfortunately don't have enough time to get super in-depth with this really interesting passage, but I wanted to briefly mention it because this understanding of the sea that we talked about, I think, really adds a lot to understanding this passage. So first of all, it clarifies that this is not just a magic trick where Jesus appears to defy the laws of nature. Rather, this is a statement that he is Yahweh, God, the only one who has power over the chaotic sea, as we saw in those Old Testament passages. In fact, when the disciples scream out in fear, what he says in the English translation is, "It is I." This is a translation of the Greek, ego eimi, which more woodenly translated means I am. In the Old Testament, this is the exact name by which God introduces himself to Moses, Yahweh, I am. So the story is portraying Jesus as able to master the waters, the sea, because he is I am. He is Yahweh. The other passage I wanted to mention briefly is Revelation 21:1. And this is at the end of John's vision, second to last chapter of the entire Bible. So we go from Genesis to the very, very end. And John says here, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more." So based on what we've talked about, this is probably not so much about the physical sea disappearing. Again, like Jesus walking on the water, it's not a magic trick. Rather, this is about the triumph of God over what the sea represents, chaos. Chaos and the suffering it creates, the pain, the fear, confusion, those things will be no more. I gave a message in which I talked about this concept of chaos about 4 years ago, and in that message I concluded it right here with the Revelation passage, the sea being no more. But when I was preparing this time, I realized that it really isn't enough. Because while this verse in Revelation offers, what I think is a beautiful vision and a powerful encouragement for us looking forward, that ultimate triumph of God's love and goodness over chaos is really hard to imagine, I think, in moments. That conclusion is often not how it looks to us or feels to us from our perspective. So what do we do as we live in the in-between, like Kenny referenced in his prayer, when we've been given this future hope, but we aren't quite there yet? Do we just try to hang on in the midst of the chaos and wait for it to be over? This is a popular strategy, I think, and one that I've taken at times. Kenny is a basketball fan, and sometimes when Autumn was a baby and she would be extremely, extremely cranky, he would joke that it was a run out the clock situation. So just hold on and survive until her bedtime when we could stop and finally take a breath and, relax while she was sleeping. So is this the best we can do spiritually? Press on? Try to ignore the painful, ugly, or inconsistencies in our lives? Essentially go into this kind of survival mode until the end when we believe something better is waiting? Or maybe we cannot ignore the ways that we or others have been hurt, and it disturbs us so much that we either completely reject the idea of a God who is in control, or maybe we remain spiritually stuck where we're at, kind of frozen in this sort of uncertainty. About 2 weeks ago, I was reading a book called Falling Upward by Richard Rohr. And this book focuses on the transition that happens in life from this earlier stage to a more mature stage. And it's a transition that doesn't necessarily happen according to age. When this shift happens, Rohr says, we move from more simplistic black and white sort of thinking to a recognition of the complexity and the grayness of life. Part of accepting the complexity of life, according to Rohr, is realizing that the chaos, the pain, the difficulty in life is not the exception, actually. This is the norm. For myself, I lived a lot of my life feeling this heavy sense of guilt that my life has been so much easier than 99.99999% of people. At other times, I felt bitter that my life is harder than some people. But the reality is that everyone's life is a mix of the wonderful, the mundane, and also the horrible. The chaos is just there. It's a part of our lives. Another important part of recognizing the complexity of life, according to Rohr, is realizing that the unavoidable, difficult, chaotic, painful times of our lives, those also tend to be the moments in life when we grow the most. It is in those times when we are challenged, we're pushed beyond our limits, maybe brought to the edge of our understanding of things, when we are forced, sometimes kicking and screaming, to grow. In those moments, we are often not only pushed to reimagine who God is, but these times often instigate a kind of shift in the way that we see and relate to the people around us as well. A beautiful potential outcome of our growth through our own tragedies is that it very naturally draws us into a deeper connection with others who have suffered. And none of this is really a new idea. We know it to be true, and everything from our classic fairy tales to our chick flicks. The hero has to face the dragon before he gets to the princess. Simba has to lose his father and leave home before he gains his kingdom again. The Hallmark Channel has taught us that the heroine, her life must fall into shambles before she is unexpectedly swept off her feet by the handsome rural stranger. But especially in our culture, in which concepts like the American dream, the prosperity gospel, have such a tight grip on us and on our minds, sometimes unconsciously, I think, maybe it is important to remind ourselves once again that suffering and misfortune are both an unavoidable part of life, and that they're also actually vital for our growth. And I really believe that we want more than to just be in that survival mode for the rest of our lives. I know I don't want my life methodology to be the running out the clock until I get to heaven. And so I am challenging myself, and I invite you as well, to see the difficult, the incomprehensible parts of life, the chaotic waters, as they're pictured in the Bible, not so much as unfair or unjust tragedies, or even necessarily as an attack of the devil, but as a natural, unavoidable part of human life, and also as an invitation to stand in the midst of the chaos rather than avoiding it or fighting it or denying it, and to let our understanding of the world and of God to expand. Let's pray to close our time. God, we bring before you the chaos of our own lives, the lives of those around us, and those around the world. On this day, Mother's Day, we are so grateful for the ways that you, who are love itself, have mothered us, a protective presence over us in the midst of both our joy and our chaos. And we are grateful for the ways that we have been mothered by the unique people in our lives, whether our world has given them the title of mother or not. We also remember those for whom Mother's Day represents not happiness, but chaos, pain, or difficulty. Show us how to better mourn with those who mourn and weep with those who weep. And in our own hard moments, when the chaos feels very threatening, help us to stand within it and allow you to change us. May we find continual encouragement in the image of the Spirit of God hovering over us and our chaos, protecting us like a mother bird. Amen.